Now in a moment, I'll turn the floor over to John Wibby, who will introduce and interview our speaker this evening. John Wibby is a producer for WBUR's On Point, where he focuses on politics, the environment, and foreign policy. He has been a reporter for the Star Ledger in New Jersey and has written for USA Today, The Huffington Post, and Boston Magazine Online, among other publications.
I want to thank everyone for coming out tonight. It's a cold night, but I think it's a worthwhile event to come to. I became familiar with Raj's work a couple years ago when we actually had him on Point with a couple of other thinkers, including Joya Mukherjee of the Partners in Health organization and John MacArthur of Millennium Challenge. Let me just introduce Raj here, and then I'll ask him some questions, and then we'll open it up to you all. Raj grew up in London, son of convenience store owners, and then got a very nice education, including he attended Oxford, he attended the London School of Economics and Cornell. He's now a visiting scholar at UC Berkeley Center for African Studies, and he's also a fellow at the Institute for Food Development Policy, also known as Food First. So I wanted to start tonight with a little bit of bio, because though I know Raj's work pretty well at the intellectual level, I actually don't know too much about who you are and how you came to be in the position that you're now in. So you get a great education, you go out, you work for the World Bank, you work for the World Trade Organization, the United Nations, and then at a certain point you end up, I guess, behind fences, being tear-gassed, protesting the very organizations that you once worked for. How do you get from being the insider to being the outsider?
It's a good question. I mean, I went in as a skeptic. I mean, the World Trade Organization was. I managed to smuggle myself in as an intern to see how how it was in the belly of the beast, and the beast, it turns out, is very bureaucratic and dull. I worked at the World Bank, and the World Bank was very interesting. Very interesting experience. I mean, for people who are not familiar with the World Bank, it's like the scene in the Terry Gilliam film, Life of Brian, not Life of Brian, the Terry Gilliam film, Time Bandits. Have people heard of Time Bandits? You know where this is going, don't you? Because the film was about disgruntled former employees of God, and the story is that the universe was built in 6 days, and it was a rush job. So God treats his workers very badly, and so they run off with a map of the universe, with the holes in the universe, and they use this to rob people. And in this one scene, they rob Napoleon. And they jump through a hole in time, and they end up in Sherwood Forest, where they're met by Robin Hood, who's played by John Cleese. And Robin Hood is very excited to see, to see Napoleon stuff, and he's like, "Well, this is tremendous! Well, thank you very much indeed. The poor will love this." And the thieves are like, "But have you met the poor? They're charming people. Of course, they don't have 2 pennies to rub together. That's because they're poor." And so there's a scene where the poor are brought on, and Hood works his way down the line, giving stuff to poor people. Like, "Rubies for you, yes, jolly good." And diamonds and gilded mirrors for you, yes. How long have you been poor? Jolly good. And then right next to him is this big bloke who takes whatever Hood has given and punches the poor person in the face. So that's how the World Bank works. And and what I was involved with was it is like that. There is the sort of, have you met the poor? Some of our best friends are poor. And that was the project that I was involved with. I was told that I would be able to work as a graduate student on a project that was about critically examining the World Bank's attitude to poverty. And in the end, what I ended up doing was working on a project that was called Voices of the Poor, Can Anyone Hear Us? And it was the World Bank basically saying, we had lunch with the poor yesterday. They were tremendous. They loved us. And in fact, the last line of the book is about how aid workers drive into the village, and spontaneously the women start dancing and singing around the fire, and they sing, "Here is the World Bank, here is the World Bank. They are here to develop us. We hope they won't forget us." And the last line of the book is, "Will we?" And of course, this sort of weird representation of the poor is part of how the World Bank operates. I mean, what I got to see inside the World Bank was how the World Bank isn't filled with these sort of Blofeldian villains who are sort of stroking cats and plotting the demise of the third world. But it turns out, the policies that they follow effectively accomplish that. And what was strange was to be part of that institution and find myself at cocktail parties, a critic of the World Bank, defending the World Bank, saying, well, if the World Bank doesn't fix sanitation, who will? And making sort of arguments that I know to be specious, but while I was in that bureaucracy, to actually be transformed a little bit by it. And so, luckily, my conscience got the better of me, and I resigned. In fact, a month after the professor who got me this job resigned from the World Bank as well. What was interesting was not so much being the critic on the inside as being a critic being transformed by the bureaucracy into someone a little bit more malleable and a little bit more accommodating to these rather nasty policies.
So I saved a little bit of your biographical detail because I want to come to food eventually, but I do want to say that he then went on to write a very provocative book which proved to be very prescient, called Stuffed and Starved, which is a worthwhile read. I believe that was published in 2007, is that right?
Yeah, 2007 UK.
And I want to come back to food, but let's start with the value of nothing, and talk about sort of where you begin. For those of you out there who have read Michael Pollan, who have read Bill McKibben, some of the terrain that Raj goes over, it would be familiar territory. But I think what you're trying to do, especially in the early part of the book, seems to be to sort of bring to bear a lot more muscle on the sort of economic canon, bringing figures from history, bringing Milton Friedman, Adam Smith, all of these different sort of thinkers into conversation with what you ultimately want to produce, which I think is a critique of an ideology which you feel kind of encompasses us and sort of gives us such a bear hug that we can hardly get out of it. And so you start really with Alan Greenspan's observation, which, if you recall, was just a year or two ago, where he famously said that he had found a flaw in his thinking. And you sort of say it's a microcosmic moment for our age. Why does that say it all to you, and how does that sort of undo in some ways this big sort of, forgive the metaphor, but another metaphor about big ball of yarn that we put together? How does it unspool the whole thing?
Well, I mean, when the sort of high priest of free market fundamentalism is forced in Congress to make some sort of, to recant to some extent the fact that the philosophy that he thought was governing the world for the past 40 years was, I mean, to say that he found a flaw in that philosophy, that there's something fundamentally wrong with it, is, I think, a momentous admission. Now, of course, the Chicago School has since reflected upon that and decided that the reason things went wrong was because markets weren't free enough. But I mean, the moment that Greenspan said that, I mean, it's like, it's like the Pope saying, yeah, God, we just made him up. It's like the sort of Catholic. I mean, it's like the Catholic Church saying, "Yeah, God doesn't even have a beard." Nothing. It's an entirely sort of fictional. I mean, admission of such moment, such magnitude, and yet the way that we've reacted to it was very much, "Oh, look, Greenspan got it wrong." Movie at 11, and I was sort of talking in the book about how it's like Kafka's book, Metamorphosis, where after a night of bad dreams, Gregor Samsa wakes up to find himself in the body of a cockroach. And in Metamorphosis, Samsa wakes up and he doesn't wonder, well, how did I become a cockroach? He doesn't wonder, what will I become tomorrow? What he worries about is his job. And that, in many ways, is how we reacted to this kind of announcement. It's not that all of a sudden this free market philosophy turned out to, its main proponent, or one of its main proponents, admitted that there was something wrong with it. And, my God, how did we get here and what can we do? But very much, oh, crap, how are we going to bring home the bacon? And I can understand why it's important to worry about your job. I mean, of course, it's reasonable. But it's also reasonable to wonder what the hell happened. And I think that in many ways, the failure to think through the full consequences of Greenspan's admission is one of the reasons why I wrote the book. It's to help us get to the bottom of what this massive admission might mean.
And that bottom is the price-value distinction.
Right.
It sounds very high concept, but let's use a couple examples from the book that I think you use to illustrate this point, and that would be the hamburger and the Nokia phone.
That's right. I mean, the hamburger example is this was some math done by some researchers in India a little while ago, and they said, look, if your hamburger is produced through cattle, by cattle that were raised on pasture that once upon a time used to be rainforest. And through the 80s, we heard these stories about rainforest being cut down so that cattle, the pasture might be grown and cattle raised thereon. Then, if we assign, or if you impute a value to the loss of biodiversity, the loss of carbon sequestered, the lost hydrological functions, the lost nutrient cycling, etc., then you can come up with a cost for that hamburger that's not $2, but nearer 200. And this cost of a hamburger doesn't include the other costs that go into a hamburger. I mean, if you're eating a hamburger in the United States, then the chances are that it will contain tomatoes that that were grown in conditions of modern-day slavery. I mean, many of the tomatoes that find their way into McDonald's and Burger King and Taco Bell and what have you are grown in southern Florida, where there are people living in conditions of modern-day slavery. And this is proper slavery. This isn't having a bad boss. This is being chained up, being denied access to water, being charged $5 for a shower. People working in the fields covered in pesticides find it cheaper to wash their hands in bleach than to pay the $5 that they're demanded for a shower. And since 1997, 1,000 people have been freed from conditions of modern-day slavery in southern Florida. And incidentally, if you're interested in getting to the bottom of the value of hamburgers, there's an organization at the back that's doing tremendous work called Value the Meal. This is the Corporate Accountability Project. And go visit them at the end if you're interested in getting more involved about bringing the real costs of that hamburger back into the equation. But I mean, another way in which we're sort of conscripted to this, and is through things like cell phones. I mean, the Congo has, in the Democratic Republic of Congo, there's 75% of the world's supply of coltan, and this mineral finds, these minerals find their way into pretty much every electronic item. They're particularly used in things like cell phones, and our complicity in sort of the consumption of these goods means that we have, according to the words of one UK cell phone campaign, blood on our cell phones. The cost of our consumption is bought at a very high price in terms of fueling conflict, fueling epidemic levels of rape, and fueling massive environmental destruction. And this isn't just a one-off thing. This isn't a sort of, well, I promise never to use a cell phone again, and thereby absolve oneself. I mean, the cost of the way that we've consumed in rich countries over the past 40 years has left a massive environmental debt. I mean, if you look at a paper from the Proceedings of the National Academy of Sciences a couple of years ago, if you add up what we owe developing countries in terms of the deforestation we've caused, the overfishing, the climate change, and what have you, about 6 different indicators they measure, the figure that, again, very conservatively they estimate, is that we owe poor countries more than $5 trillion. Now, the way that we do math, of course, they owe us. We're always hearing about third world debt. Third world debt is $1.8 trillion. But we owe them $5 trillion that we've managed to escape, not accidentally, but systematically through the way that markets operate.
So this is the distinction between sort of, if we come back to price and value, and we start talking about solutions, which the second half of your book focuses a lot on that. So, we have cheap cell phones, we have cheap hamburgers, we have polluted the atmosphere massively. There are all of these ways in which we've ignored what you would call externalities, which are part of the economic lingo. Well, I was thinking about you, Raj, and I was wondering where in the book are you going to go here? Someone who's progressive on all sorts of issues, is he going to end up favoring sort of state socialist intervention? Do nations have to become more liberal? Is he going to go with sort of multinational organizations? Where is he going to go? And he came up with this very interesting kind of, for lack of a better term, third way, which has to do with commons. And I think it's worth unpacking a little bit because it's a little bit complicated. But so your solution to this problem that we don't price things how they should be valued is a form of democracy, people organizing to produce a result where they would get back ownership of certain land resources, water resources, things which you call the kind of rise of the commons. What does that look like, and who's doing it right now?
Well, I mean, the commons is, it's a tricky concept to get your head around. I mean, when I really didn't understand what it was for a long time. I mean, in Britain we have the House of Commons, which, if you are to just derive what happens there and see if you can figure out what commons means, you will understand commons as sort of drinking club for aggressively drunk white men. But in the United States, when I came here, the first time we ever came on holiday, we came to New York, my family, and we were told, when you're in New York, you must go to Woodbury Common. It's tremendously exciting. And it turns out that Woodbury Common is an outlet mall, and we didn't have any of those in the UK. And so I thought that common was American for shopping. But of course, the way that many people get introduced to this idea of the common is through the tragedy of the commons. And the tragedy of the commons, I sort of write about its origins. It was written, it's a piece that appeared in Science in 1968, and it was written by a soil biologist called Garrett Hardin. And it wasn't based on any empirical study, it was entirely a thought experiment. And the thought experiment went like this. Imagine that we all here share a resource, but no one owns it. And we would say that we all live around a forest. And assume that we are all selfish, greedy bastards. And that what we're going to do is actually just maximize our use of the forest. And because the forest is unowned, no one takes care of the forest. The consequence of this is that by exercising our desires, we end up taking trees from the forest and gently and progressively pillaging a resource that we know we depend on. And the tragedy comes from the fact that we knowingly, with eyes wide open, destroy the very resource that we need to survive. We saw off the branch that we're sitting on. Now, as a thought experiment, it's very compelling if you accept the assumption that an unowned resource is going to be ravaged by greedy people. But if you look at the history of the commons, you find that actually it's perfectly possible for people not merely to be greedy, selfish bastards. I mean, although we have selfish genes, the way that we have evolved is not merely to be selfish. If we're talking about survival of the fittest, the way that we have become fit is to be cooperative and to be able to be generous and to be able to work with one another. And so the history of the commons is actually a history of, in many cases, people figuring out how to internalize these externalities, how to make sure that commons are maintained. And if that sounds all very sort of pie in the sky, again, there was a very interesting study, again, in the Proceedings of the National Academy of Sciences, that looked at 80 forest communities. And looked at a range of different variables, and it turns out that forest communities that are given enough forest to manage and enough autonomy from the government and from the private sector not only manage that resource very well and have higher development outcomes than those who are not autonomous, but also they're able to sequester more carbon. In other words, they're able to maintain the forest much better if they're able to use it in common than if you let in the government or the private sector. So there are examples of commoning happening today.
So let's talk about one of those. So La Via Campesina is one that you have worked with and studied. Let's talk about that.
Well, I mean,
talk about that movement.
Well, La Via Campesina is an international movement of peasants, rural workers, and landless people, over 150 million people. Now, in that movement, there are groups that aren't commoning. I mean, there are cases where they do, but as a movement, the reason I think that La Via Campesina is very interesting is that they offer a profound way of getting out of, they're dealing with food at the moment, but they offer a profound way of recentering the market and of controlling markets in a democratic way. And they talk about needing the right to have rights over our food system. They have this idea of food sovereignty, it's called. And food sovereignty essentially means that communities need to be able to have the right to shape their own food policy and their own agriculture policy. This isn't to say that farmers must be telling all consumers what to do, but instead that there be an equalizing of power relations over the distribution of food and of the setting of the terms of food policy. Now, that's very different from anything we've ever seen in terms of food policy. It's always been the outcome of imperialism and of patriarchy. I talk a lot about the unequal gender relations in food production and consumption in developing countries. And why I think Via Campesina is tremendously interesting is that one of their slogans around food sovereignty and about re-empowering communities to take control of their food is this, that food sovereignty is about an end to all forms of violence against women. Food sovereignty is about an end to all forms of violence against women. Now that's radically different from anything that we've ever seen when it comes to addressing the food system, and it's something that's not about recreating some bucolic past with sort of farmers chewing straw and butterflies and just sort of some imagined rural community. But actually, it's about transforming the relations of production that actually underwrite capitalism, and I think that's a very exciting way in which we can address inequalities of power as a sort of step towards figuring out ways of internalizing these externalities. So you want to give more power to some of these indigenous movements. You want more democracy, small d. I thought John Gray had an interesting, in an otherwise reasonably flattering review in The Observer of your book, I thought raised a very interesting question. And he said, and this is a question he thought that you didn't answer sufficiently. He says, when oppressed minorities have improved their lot, will they not want to live as most people in affluent societies do? And how would you respond to that? I think that's right. I mean, and we have a sort of dance here between acknowledging, and as I do in the book, the fact that we overconsume. We've managed to shuffle off this huge debt to developing countries, and yet now have set a standard that developing countries, people in developing countries aspire to. So I certainly think that as part of just consuming our fair share, we need to consume less. I mean, if we were to consume as much, if the world were to consume as much meat as the average American does, we'd need 7 planets. We don't have 7 planets, we have just one. And of course, within developing countries, there's also a tug of war between elites that are gearing up towards consuming vast amounts and nonetheless a persistent base of poverty that is being denied through capitalism the ability to consume anything at all. And so, I mean, if you take the example of India, where India last year, the year before last, had more billionaires in the Forbes top 10 billionaires list than any other country, more than the United States, more than China, more than anywhere else. And yet India is seeing levels of hunger among the poorest people creeping up at the same time. And also India is now home to the largest number of people who have type 2 diabetes. It is a health catastrophe that India will be paying for a very long time. So I certainly think that in terms of consuming the way that we do, it's unsustainable. It's already taking a huge toll in developing countries. And we don't have a planet that's big enough to support it. And what we're seeing with oppressed minorities in India that I write about in the book is actually that they're looking for different ways of consuming. It's not that everyone has the aspiration to, particularly from the very poorest communities, to replicate the Western lifestyle when they know that it's unsustainable. And people are looking for alternatives. So I certainly, I certainly think that it is just and fair that people in developing countries have decent healthcare, have their full human rights realized, just as I think that it's important to have the right to food realized in the United States, where 49.2 million Americans went hungry in 2008. I think that the basic platform of human rights everywhere is one that does need to be realized. But I also think that unsustainable consumption is unsustainable no matter where it happens.
Well, I wanted to not turn to unrelated matters, but I think that kind of takes you through the kind of arc of the book. Now, of course, you should buy it and read and fill in all of the details yourself. But before we open it up to questions, I just wanted to ask you I just wanted to hit some of the news headlines. One of which, sort of maybe a minor headline, but I think an important one, is a battle that you have been in with the Bill and Melinda Gates Foundation. And for those of you who aren't readers of The Nation magazine, you should go read this, and you can find it online, where Raj and several others wrote a pretty biting critique of what the Gates Foundation is trying to do in Africa, and you elicited a response, a letter from them, and then you replied. And I think for a lot of people out there who don't pay a lot of attention to food issues, they would say, Raj, you're a progressive, you want to feed the world. Bill Gates is trying to feed the world. This organization seems well-intentioned. How is it that you've come to engage in sort of fisticuffs with the Gates Foundation? Why is that? Explain to us.
Well, I mean, obviously, feeding the hungry in Africa is entirely noble, and I think that's that it is to be celebrated that people want to do that. But I mean, it's you have this idea of give a man a fish and you feed him for a day. Teach a man to fish and you feed him for a lifetime. And this kind of logic is one that seems reasonable enough. But think about the way that represents people in developing countries. You have little Tunde running by the side of the river, and you're told, teach Tunde to fish and you'll feed him for a lifetime, but merely give him a fish and you'll feed him for a day. And so you have this idea that Tunde is sitting by the river, sort of eating fish, and then looks over to the side of the river and wonders, looks inside the river and says, well, what's that? That looks like a fish. How will I get it out? I don't know. I will have to wait for the white man to come and tell me. This idea of charity assumes a kind of blank slate, assumes that there aren't things going on in Africa right now, and that things in Africa don't have a history. And unfortunately, the approach that the Bill and Melinda Gates Foundation have taken is to basically set Africa on a course of green revolution technologies, technologies that require the import of fertilizer and of increasingly genetically modified crops, and an adoption of scale of farming that is that requires larger scales, that requires access to irrigation, that seems in many ways ill-suited to the conditions in Africa. And so essentially what they're doing is, and you can hardly blame Bill Gates for following this kind of model, where what they're doing is a lot of bright people being brought together in a room, figuring out the problem and exporting it to the third world. And Bill Gates made his billions by lots of bright people being in a room, and he will figure it out and then get the results to you. You don't even have to know what's in it. You just have to use it and shut up. And that model of producing windows is one that he has applied to models of producing seed and of producing solutions for agricultural problems in developing countries. The trouble is that when you look at how that, what that means, you end up in some deep water. I mean, I was in Malawi 3 weeks ago, where I was there to look at the Malawi miracle. I mean, Malawi is meant to be a place where things are going right, where as a result of subsidizing fertilizer and following, sort of drinking the Kool-Aid of industrial agriculture, things are going terrifically. So I land, and the first thing that I notice is there are huge queues outside gas stations. And the reason is because, well, Malawi's landlocked. Malawi doesn't have natural resources. It doesn't have any oil. Its biggest export is tobacco, and the tobacco market is pretty bad right now. And that means that its foreign exchange reserves are limited. And last year, when fertilizer was really expensive, the government made a bad decision. They used all their foreign exchange to buy fertilizer. So now this year, there's no money left to buy fuel. There's no money left to buy gasoline. And that's why there is huge queues outside the gas stations, because rumor has it, has got around that tomorrow the gas tank will come to this station, then you'll be able to get some gas. And if you look in rural areas in Malawi, there are alternatives that are thriving. And I was lucky enough to be able to see examples where there's polycultural agriculture going on. In other words, where you plant legumes that build soil fertility, you plant crops that are attractors to insects over here, so that you have a crop that is unmolested by insects over there. And you end up with a system that doesn't require the agricultural capitalism that the Gates Foundation is sponsoring. But instead, you have a robust system that's well suited to the resources there, that actually produces more, that is, that's able to withstand climate change in ways that are better than a monoculture, and that aren't hostage to the dreams of a few people in Redmond, Washington, or in fact in Seattle, in Washington, figuring it out for you. And so, although the Gates Foundation is philanthropy, 2.0, and it is. It is utterly well-intentioned. The fact remains that the reason that the Gates Foundation is necessary is because organizations like the World Bank destroyed the capacity for African countries to maintain their own agriculture. And the solution is not to have wealthy philanthropists doing it, but to have actually a restitution of the capacity to be able to do it domestically. And with organizations like Food First, with whom I wrote this piece, we're working with African organizations under the umbrella "We Are the Solution" to demonstrate that actually you don't need billions of dollars coming from the United States. You need, in many ways, the United States to stop its policies of agricultural capital, promoting agricultural capitalism, and allow some of these other experiments to thrive.
Just maybe one more question, and then we'll open it up. On the, it's sort of along the same lines. You've been, in the past, reasonably critical of a pretty key player for the Gates Foundation for quite a while, and his name happens to be Raj Shah, who was just appointed the head of USAID. I'm wondering what you think of Mr. Shah, and I'd also like to know what you think of sort of Obama and foreign aid generally, and then I'd just like to open it up to the audience. So how do you score kind of the Obama administration on issues of foreign aid and development, and in particular, what do you think of the new head of USAID?
Well, I think Raj Shah is tremendously intelligent and tremendously talented, and clearly knows how Washington works, but because he was able to move from being a medical doctor, just a few years ago, to being an agricultural expert, to now being the administrator for USAID, and that takes some chops, or some other bodily part. I know that he takes his job very seriously, and that he's tremendously committed. So I certainly think that in terms of able technocrats, he's an appropriate person to be heading USAID. But of course, that's the problem with USAID. USAID has always been an institution that furthers US foreign policy goals. This isn't some conspiratorial idea that I've just made up. The USAID has admitted as much, that its aid has always been directed at countries that were geopolitically important for the United States. It just so happens that Africa is turning out to be very geopolitically important for the United States, because there is a new scramble for Africa. It turns out that Africa has oil. It turns out that Africa has a range of resources that are interesting for the United States. And it turns out that all of a sudden other countries are scrambling for Africa too. And so China, but of course, yes, China's going for Africa, but it's important also to unpick the reporting about China. The reporting is good. you won't believe what China are doing in Africa. They're doing what we did 100 years ago. You know, particularly when you look at the way Europe, for example, has been you know, sort of carved up Africa. China is merely the latest entrant in a series of foreign incursions into Africa. But in terms of what that means for USAID, I mean, I think that there is a friendlier face on pretty much the same policies. I mean, I'm seeing, you know, no real shift when it comes to fighting hunger, for example, away from the idea that Africa needs to be force-fed genetically modified crops, or needs to be opened up to you know, agricultural capitalism in one way or another. I'm seeing fairly strong continuities between the old administration and the new one. And what I'm not seeing is any real commitment to letting, you know, to you know, moving away from the kinds of loans that rig the game against you know, African agriculture and African agricultural movements. I'm seeing really the same what James Ferguson calls anti-politics machine. The idea that just a few experts will come in and solve problems that are inherently political, and instead take the politics out of the problem and render it into a technical one. And that process of the anti-politics machine of USAID is sadly in good hands with Dr. Shah. It's a terrific question. I mean, and if I'm paraphrasing it correctly, I mean, you know, jumping off from the Malawi miracle, at what level does food sovereignty matter, and what level does it obtain? And certainly, I mean, I remember thinking, being very pleased that you know, that Malawi was sticking it to the man and refusing to merely sort of allow neoliberal forces in to shape its agriculture policy, as it had under the IMF, for example, with some fairly disastrous consequences, but instead was investing in agriculture. At the same time, I was worried that, in fact, investing in a resource that that is unsustainable itself wasn't necessarily the way to go. But for Via Campesina, I think that there's no, the step of rejecting the World Bank is a positive one. The step then of surrendering oneself to the fertilizer industry is not necessarily an example of sovereignty. And that's why I like this idea of food sovereignty is about an end to all forms of violence against women, because all of a sudden that puts every level in play. It starts at the household, and I mean, Via Campesina is, I mean, is struggling with its own sort of internal, it's facing its own internal struggles around sexism, for example, and it's resolving it in some very interesting ways. There's a gender committee and a women's committee, a space where women are able to organize by themselves, and a space where the movement is forced to confront gender inequality somewhere else. And it's taking that very seriously. So, you know, within a movement level, that's something they're working through. But the idea of thinking about food sovereignty as an end to all forms of violence against women means that you tackle inequalities in the distribution of labor around food within the home, but then you also tackle that at a community level. And again, by talking about forms of violence against women, one summons ideas about rights. One has a safety net against community failure, because I agree that communities can fail. And one of the reasons why this slogan is helpful is because it points out that in order to safeguard against that, one ought to safeguard against the way that communities most routinely fail, which is through sexism. And then to sort of think about community levels, nation levels, national levels, and international levels. And if you look at the definition of food sovereignty, you'll see that it is about states, unions, and nations' right to have control over their food system. Now, the fact that there are 3 different geographical units that are part of the equation show that there's a kind of balkanized geography of where food sovereignty obtains, everywhere from, as I say, the household to the international level. And these overlapping layers of sovereignty are, I think, tremendously helpful. I mean, I think this idea of a balkanized idea of, not balkanized in the sense of nations fragmented irredeemably, but balkanized in the original sense of balkanized, where you have competing jurisdictions layered upon one another. That helps to get to the heart of what food sovereignty is. It's a sort of permanent multi-jurisdictional geography of rights. As I say, all the way from the smallest sphere, from the household, to planetary kinds of jurisdiction. So the first point, actually the real Malawi miracle is William Kakwamba, a boy who built the windmill, and his book was terrific, and his experience of building windmills for his village is really very exciting. But there was also a question about can we get Elinor Ostrom, who won the Nobel Prize in Economics this year, in conversation with Gandhi, who had visions about economics founded on lifting up the poorest first. And it is interesting that in one of a few rare moments of sanity, the committee that awards the Nobel Prize in memory of the prize in honor of Alfred Nobel awarded the prize to for the first time to a woman in part, and also for work on different ways of managing the economy other than by relying on free markets. Now, I think Elinor Ostrom's work is tremendously interesting, but it's also, justifiably, I think, comes under criticism from the left for being entirely compatible with the kinds of systems we have at the moment. In other words, it's possible to use common property resource regimes that Elinor Ostrom has in ways that merely make the existing kinds of inequality and resource predation manageable. It's a way for those in power to decentralize the responsibilities for managing resources without ever having to take take responsibility for them. In other words, commons can become a management tool. A way of keeping the status quo going, but using people's own organizing ability to be able to suffer that status quo a little more consensually. But it is, and in the book I talk about Gandhian and Buddhist economics that actually has this sort of idea of social justice behind it. And I think it's important to, and also to obviously talk about sort of anti-capitalist struggles that involve a more honest reading of how the commons work. Because the commons historically has always been about a battle for resources in the context of, certainly in the British case, in the English case of privatization. Commons have always been, in other words, a space for politics at the borders of the commons as well as within the commons. And that's, I think that's, in a sense, much more in keeping with the spirit of the commons. That there's something about challenging bigger inequalities in power in the way that commons work and commons have historically worked than one might necessarily get from reading purely the sort of catalogue of Elinor Ostrom's work. So it's a long way of saying actually it's almost necessary to be involved in social justice and involved in struggles around capitalism fully to realize the full potential of the idea of the commons. And this is without romanticizing. I mean, obviously there are common resource pool regimes that are discriminatory, and that's why I think it's important to marry ideas about the commons and social justice with these ideas of rights. Otherwise, you end up with commons that work just by excluding people, and that's that seems to be not in keeping with social justice either. So I think there's a lot of borrowing that needs to happen. But the good news is that there are lots of ideas around that we can fuse together and actually develop in some very interesting ways. How do we sort of get the narrative out? Well, I mean, buy the book, tell your friends, as my publishers have instructed me to say. But I mean, though actually, get your library to get this book. And that way you spend less money, you build commons, you build community resources, but and you get to read the book for free. How cool is that? Though, as we say, support independent bookstores and venues like this, and can't win for losing. But I mean, in terms of getting the word out about the failure of the market, frankly, the right's ahead of us. I mean, what are teabaggers if not people who are disillusioned with the failure of the market, and who the right have mobilized and successfully managed to corral. I mean, I think, although it's important to laugh at the madness that's coming from the right, it's also important to take it very seriously. And again, I mean, in the book, this idea that this term, market society, comes from Karl Polanyi, and read more about him in the book, or read his fantastic book, The Great Transformation. But the idea, I mean, he was writing in the teeth of the Second World War, and he was writing about how when the illusion of the self-regulating market eviscerates the society on which it depends, society can and does reach back to protect itself in a double movement. Now, that second movement, the movement of society redressing the overreaching of the free market, needn't be progressive. There's nothing, I mean, there was nothing progressive about 1930s Germany or Italy. But that was a response to the failure of the market and a way in which the story got out, and the story was not a good one. And that's, I mean, that's why, and that's why I was moved to write this book, and that's why I think that there's, there's a lot of organizing already happening on the right, but there's also a great deal happening on the left. I mean, if you look at, I mentioned this figure of 49.2 million Americans going hungry in 2008. That figure is going to go up in 2009. For reasons that are fairly straightforward in terms of unemployment. Food prices were slightly down in 2009, but not by a whole lot. You're seeing people very acutely aware of the failure of the market and the failure of free market capitalism. And you are seeing some movement towards actually some great organizing. And of course, I mean, the best organizing tool is success. The best way to recruit people to a particular kind of new vision is for it to work quite well. And you're seeing things like food policy councils throughout the United States and Canada doing very good jobs in not only sort of filling the gap where the state has failed and the private sector doesn't particularly want to go, but also building structures in which future kinds of organizing can flourish. And I think that the kind of organizing that happens in churches, that happens in community groups, that happens at the grassroots, that actually leads to progressive solutions that work for people. Whether it's, I mean, everything from the Black Panthers school lunches, for example, breakfast programs, were tremendous organizing opportunities. Here in the United States, there's the school lunch reauthorization, the Child Nutrition Reauthorization Act that's coming up this year, which is an opportunity to organize with a successful outcome within reach. But I do think that there are lots of opportunities, particularly around food, to be able to get an alternative message out, not by hitting people over the head with your many copies of The Value of Nothing, but by actually organizing for ways that work to fight hunger and work to fight it in a way that work to eradicate things like food banks. I mean, in Canada, there's a wonderful organization, a food bank in Toronto called The Stop. And their mission statement is basically, they're a food bank that wants to put themselves out of business. And is that kind of organizing, that sort of future orientation, that like, actually we don't want to live in a society with food banks. We want to live in a society where the communities are empowered to grow their own food and to be able to afford to buy their own food. That kind of organizing with that kind of vision is a great way of getting the word out. And I think that's going to succeed. Well, it has to, otherwise we're in for some very dark times.
The Farm Bill, the upcoming Farm Bill.
Yes, in this book I don't talk about the Farm Bill. It was in Stuffed and Starved I talked about it a little more, but I'm happy to talk about it now because there's already organizing around the next Farm Bill. And that's happening in a range of forums, and Food First is the organization that I'm associated with in Oakland, in California, is doing some great work on it. But I mean, essentially, I mean, I think at heart it lies the problem that the USDA is a plaything of agribusiness, and that a Department of Food rather than a Department of Agriculture is really what we need to be aiming for. And I mean, the point of starting to organize around that now rather than to organize usually the year before is when things sort of start to get going, is that we need to organize for a farm bill that doesn't last 5 years but lasts 50. And that vision of the Farm Bill and means that we need to reorient the way that we, the way the state intervenes in those kinds of markets. I mean, I certainly think that I mean, Michael Pollan has some very good ideas on this in terms of, stop subsidizing corn, think about different ways in which we access food in the community. But I think that the way in which we make that happen, the way in which we succeed in a 50-year Farm Bill, is a tough question. And I think that when we're talking about organizing for a farm bill that lasts for 50 years. That means organizing now around things like the Child Nutrition Reauthorization Act, and building the kinds of community networks that are set up to address hunger right now, that then leverage into a farm bill that lasts for 50 years. I mean, I think that the only way that we can build up a head of steam strong enough to be able to unseat the USDA from its present trajectory is really to actually have a big grassroots movement. We kind of fumbled it, I think, with the last farm bill, and hoped that a Democratic Congress would be able to trump a Republican president. But I think particularly when we have an administration where the head of the USDA is so beholden to big ag, and when you have the president himself in his autobiography was talking about, I don't know if you caught this in his autobiography, he talks about how he used to fly around in private jets, and he has this almost pornographic description of the private jet, him being pressed gently into the leather chair as the jets gripped the air and thrust the airplane forward. And that was the Archer Daniels Midland jet that he was in. And of course, then the president said, well, I need to be down with the people, and so I stopped flying in private jets, and I just flew commercial first class, where he met the people. But this is the president from the former senator from Iowa. I mean, it's Illinois, and this is Illinois is agribusiness central. We ought not to be deluded that this is a president who is very close to those kinds of big agricultural interests. And that does mean that to knock him off that trajectory requires a great deal of organizing. And again, it gets back to your question about, well, then how do we get the word out? How do we make that organizing successful? And the only way we do that is by building actually successful alternatives to the existing system right now and leveraging them for change 3 years from now.
Do you want to just work backwards? So
sure, yeah.
Marxism first.
So yeah, I mean, I share the worry that what when you have a state that concentrates a vast amount of power and is able to externalize its costs in big ways, that's something to be worried about. But of course, that's the situation we're in right now. And I'm very suspicious of large states. I think that actually a lot of what I'm talking about involves, I mean, I talk a lot about democracy, about how in order to defeat what the perils of the free market, what we need is actually way more democracy. What we live in right now is a complainocracy, where every 2 years you get to boot out people who have disappointed you and replace them with people who have yet to disappoint you. But what we don't have is a democracy, maybe in the Athenian sense of democracy, the classical Athens kind of democracy, with all its problems and their big problems. But in that kind of democracy, people were chosen at random every year. 6,000 people were chosen to be the government, and then at the end of the year, those 6,000 were disbanded. Another 6,000 chosen at random. And it's that kind of connection to democracy and accountability that actually you're seeing in a lot of the movements around food sovereignty. And I think that's something that in itself is a guard against the kinds of tyranny either of big corporations or of big government that I think we both share. In terms of what we can be doing differently, I mean, I think. I was in front of the House Financial Services Committee arguing that what the US needs to do is not fund the World Bank. I think that already it's a mistake to think that, well, I mean, you actually, and you have it in your question, you're right to say that we need to stop doing some of the things that we're doing. And I think forgiving the debt is the first step. And in other words, sort of severing those ties in which US power is consistently leveraged. But then, actually, we need to go further. I mean, there are reparations that this country needs to make. And reparations is always the thorny question, and Naomi Klein has a wonderful article about how the US is shit scared of that idea when talking about racism. But when talking about environmental debt, we owe developing countries a shitload of money, and I think that getting close to repaying that is tremendously important. Which gets us to in fact, all three of these questions are connected, because I think what works well in the United States. And I mean, it's been interesting over the past decade to see the food movement in the United States grow. And so, at the beginning of, well, at the end of the 90s, the United States was the place where animators in the triplets of Belleville could portray everyone in America as sort of obese and just sort of ponderous and eating hamburgers and not really caring about their food. Has everyone seen the triplets of Belleville? Is it sort of this representation of America as just sort of inured to the quality of food and just people sort of stuffing their faces was the representation. And yet, of any rich country, the United States food movement has now become really very, very exciting. In part, I think, because activism had very few places that it could successfully manage to go in the Bush administration. I think the food movement, in part, was a product of Bush. And I think its success is one of the places where activism successfully was managed to take a foothold. And so in the United States, unlike many countries that I visited, a lot of young people want to go into farming. A lot of people want to be involved in food issues. The membership of Slow Food, which I used to describe as a kind of circle jerk of olive oil fanciers, and is actually a young and dynamic, and I'm super excited about where they're going now. And so, in that sense, I'm excited by that. That movement. I think the limits in terms of the United States was also sort of embedded in your question, which is what is we as consumers, what can we do? And I think that it's actually we as citizens. And last week I became a citizen, so I'm now very much invested in this question of what it is that we as citizens can do. And I think that the limits of the food movements, well, the food movement hits a boundary that it doesn't need to when it sees us merely as consumers. And that's why I think the possibilities of democracy and the possibilities of taking our government back are ones that we can only achieve as citizens, not as consumers. And that's something I'm very excited about.
Well, Raj, I want to thank you for a great talk.